But I've got to mention the recommendations at least, because we have to move beyond analysis. So let me quickly just run through these. Pardon me if I'm going fast here. If this is a climogenic society, and it is, then we recognize as African people that our major problem is not being left out of the American mainstream and being left out of the system. We must recognize that we cannot join a criminal system because we will become criminals in it. Colin Powell represents the apotheosis, the ultimate of what a criminal system is. He represents what it means to move up in a criminal society. In moving into that system and becoming integrated in it and assimilated with it, he must now become allied with this criminality. And if that system then is dependent upon the death and damnation of black people, upon the imperial subordination of black people, then those like Colin Powell that move up in this system must also then engage in the death and damnation of black people as well. We have to keep that in mind. You're not moving up into this system as it is unless you're also moving against the interests of black people. And therefore you have to recognize that the goal of our people in this crimogenic society is to change the very nature of the social system, to tear it apart and to reconstruct it, to bring into being that word that Bush stole from us, a new world order. Our mission is much higher than assimilating into this system. It must be to create a new world. If this crimogenic society creates a sense of powerlessness in our children, then we must, as a people, develop and use our power. We must take power and train our youth for taking and expressing power positively. If this system destroys the attitudes of our people through projection and projecting on them criminality, we must inoculate our children against evil white projections by inoculating them with truth and the truth of themselves, inoculating them with self-knowledge. We must inoculate them against projection and the internalization of negative attitudes by getting them into the knowledge and the psychology and the ways of their white enemies, and getting them to have an efficient perception of reality and remove their deceptions. If they are alienated from themselves and are infused by an evil white spirit who is implanted in their minds and bodies to serve the will of its devilish masters, then we must reclaim our African-centered identity, and we must reclaim an African-centered consciousness, and we must learn to love ourselves and love each other and engage in cooperation and communalism. This is how we prevent alienation. If the society twists our desires and makes us desire the things that destroy us and hate the things that advance our interests, we must learn a new set of values, inculcate deep and abiding cultural goals, learn to discern when one is being manipulated and exploited. Our children must learn the mechanisms of advertising, mass hypnosis, subliminal suggestion, conditioning, and lies and propaganda. They must learn to be productive so that they can produce for their own desires. They must learn to assume the ownership of the means of production and learn self-control. If the society moves our children into black-on-black violence because it engages them in frustration and the dealing with their frustration in incorrect ways, then we must train our children to be task-oriented, to solve the causes of problems and not engage in dealing with the symptoms of problems. We must teach them to discern the sources of their frustration and remove those sources and tear them out from the root. We must teach them how to use their anger and aggressive feelings positively. Every emotion that is in the human mind is there for a positive reason, and they must be used for positive reasons. Anger is a positive emotion if it is used correctly. So is aggression. God did not put anger and aggression in you just for negative purposes alone, but we must be taught how to use those things. We must teach them to be resourceful and how to get around those frustrations, to develop social intelligence, skills, and competence. We must teach them coping strategies for stress. If they displace their anger and use their anger to attack themselves and destroy themselves and to destroy others like themselves, we must get them to know their real enemy. We must get them to recognize that this enemy, this white man, is only a man, that he bleeds and dies like any other man. We must read to him the history of our African fathers as they cut down and mowed down the white man, and how they were only betrayed by their own cupidity. We must have them understand that. Let them read the story of the Egyptians as they cut, the Ethiopians as they cut down the Italian armies, and read the stories of the other Africans as they cut down the white armies. Bush thinks he's gotten away with this little game, but it's not over. It's not over. By the very fact that he engaged in this war, we now know what his game plan is. We now know his weaknesses and his strengths. As a matter of fact, ladies and gentlemen, his strength is his weakness. Understand? And we're going to teach our children how to tear up the soft underbelly of this dragon and this monster called white America. I was down at Tuskegee last weekend, and I saw the Chappie James Aerospace Center. Interesting. But one thing we've learned about this war here is that once we get an Air Force, we are ready. And so we're going to set him up. The only thing that got this man across was he was not resisted in the air. And we will meet him in the air and on the ground. Recognize that the white man can be defeated, that he's not invincible. We must teach them that the displacement of anger at self or at others like at ourselves makes matters worse and is self-destructive. If they are having problems with their self-concept, then we must give them great support. We must affirm them and affirm their identity. We must teach them confirmations so that they know how to make positive statements to themselves and affirm themselves. We must teach them how to stop negative thoughts and change the nature of the situation that they are in. If they are engaged in violence and black upon black violence, we must teach them how to resolve conflicts between themselves without destroying themselves. It means then that we have to develop relevant educational programs. We have to develop a parallel school system. We have to make this government, by hook or crook, fund the health care systems of the local and state localities of our people. We must emphasize prevention in the black community, change the lifestyles of our people who are literally eating themselves to death, or whose lifestyles are literally destroying their health. My next book is going to be on black health, by the way, and I'm going to show how the death wishes, how we carry out the death wishes of whites through our eating and health habits. Because they wish that we will die, we accommodate them by drinking too much Pepsi and all the other things. We're going to emphasize critical problems. We must develop programs to ensure adequate prenatal counseling and care. We must develop systems to neutralize the crimogenic system. We must set it our goal, not the assimilation to the society, but the elimination of this society as it is. We must set as our goal economic development, the development of the economic status of our people across this world. We must engage in the development of a nation within a nation. How can a people keep saying that they are kept out of the society and are separated and segregated from the society, and not use that to their advantage and create a nation within a nation and get ready to fight the other evil nation in the society. We must engage our people in consumer education, withdraw from those entities and those industrial systems and so forth that are a part and parcel of the destruction of the black community and the communities of Africans. We have to stop buying those Nike sneakers and Reebok sneakers that sell 70% of their wares to black people while they refuse to even franchise black stores to sell those sneakers. We must stop buying Ford Motor Company cars when they take out those car factories from Detroit and import them into Polish and other neighborhoods. And after we get through with Ford, we stop buying GM. And after we get through with GM, we stop buying Toyota and the rest. We will not subsidize the destruction of our people. We must develop an African-centered, full African-centered educational program. We must educate our males. It is very important that we pull these males aside and train them for manhood, train them for husbandhood and fatherhood, and train them for the military so that they undertake the overthrow of the system. We must engage our young people in political education so that they will learn how to engage in the political overthrow of their enemies and organize themselves politically. We must train those of us who want to go into this church into a new theology, that it is not enough to paint, the face of Jesus or to paint the face of angels and still believe in the same Eurocentric ideology and theology. We must go into these prisons and take our men from these prisons. These are the men who must be used to defend our community. They must be rehabilitated on the lines of an African-centered philosophy and on political lines and military lines so that they can use their aggression now, not against themselves or against the nation of African people, but against the true enemies of African people, the white man. We must develop regional conferences in our nation within a nation and a national congress so that we can coordinate and facilitate the talents of our people who are engaged in various aspects of the political, social, and economic reorganization of this country. We must build schools for leadership. We must build schools that engage in policy development and analysis, and schools for developing strategy, schools for developing a military machine to protect us against the interests of Europeans. Recognize that there's one thing that's clear, that the imperialistic system has only one constant, and that is self-interest. And when it is in its self-interest to destroy and wipe black people from the face of this earth, it will engage in that activity. You have the history of the Indians in America to show that when a people are economically not useful to the Europeans proceed to annihilate those people. Therefore, ladies and gentlemen, we must prepare for revolution and prepare for war. Thank you very much.